out of the Chief City Planner of London, Peter Wynne Rees. Can you please?
Your Excellency, ladies and gentlemen, it's a great privilege to be here today, and in addition to welcoming you all in the audience, I'd like to welcome our other two audiences on this side of the hall. And on this side of the hall, I'd like to let you know that, of course, you have a screen to watch me on, but the three screens in the hall are not coming from the same feed. There are different television companies covering your conference and your conference. On your side, you have CNN, and you'll see that my smile has been digitally enhanced. And if I come to anything that's of the least interest, it'll be cut for advertisements. Now, on this side of the hall, you're receiving BBC World Service, and you couldn't have anything better than that. You'll find the diction is absolutely superb, and if you just look underneath your seats, you'll find there's a small remote control. So if you become bored of what I'm saying, just press the button and you can have sport or drama or anything that you like. Now, in the centre of the hall, of course, you had it streamed on Al Jazeera, but of course you have me in person. And this is one of those opportunities where I'm able to come to Ctbuh conference and have a little chat with you all to see where you're getting with your professional endeavours on tall buildings. Don't show. Tall buildings, sustainability, carbon footprints. Now, you've heard from David Scott that this is a fully carbon neutral conference. And you're probably wondering how this has been achieved. Well, every time one of you filled in one of those booking forms on the internet and sent it off, and of course your funds were cleared, Jerry Carey and the hard-working staff at Ctbuh rushed out and planted a tree. And I have to say, the area around Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, is now looking rather like something out of the Canadian outback. There are a lot of trees. But with all that hard work, the conference hasn't been able to become entirely carbon neutral. And so what David didn't tell you was that we've thought of a way of completing the carbon neutrality of the conference and also reflecting local cultural sensitivity. You'll notice that no alcohol will be served at this conference. So that will make us fully carbon neutral. I hope you will understand that. It's extremely important. There are three criteria that determine where people build. Location, location, and location. And that's equally true for environmental sustainability. Whether it's the environmental, the physical, or the social sustainability of a place, choosing the right place is the secret to your success. It doesn't matter what you build, or as I said in the title of my paper, it ain't what you build, it's the place where you build it. First of all, the environmental sustainability. Now, there are an awful lot of question marks over environmental sustainability and green issues. This is one of those topics where the politicians are ahead of the experts. And that's always a dangerous situation. There are far too... That was the BBC microphone. I'm now on the CNN microphone. And I hope this one works better in your side of the hall, together with a better smile. I'm not quite sure what was wrong with the last microphone, but this one is louder, that's true. I was talking about environmental sustainability and green issues. An awful lot of people have answers to sustainability. The problem is they have more answers than questions. People are surer of the solutions very often than they are of the problem. For instance, we hear that there is global warming. Well, what is the base figure? What is the correct figure? I don't know. All I do know is that even 200 years ago, the River Thames in the City of London was freezing over, and they used to have a frost fair. On the ice, it was that thick. It hasn't frozen over for years. And it wasn't freezing over long before the motor car came to London. So how much of the warming of the planet is due to the activity of man? I don't know. We hear that motor cars are bad. Well, obviously too many motor cars are bad, and indeed our own mayor in London, Mayor Livingston, has a campaign at the moment to reduce the number of motor cars in London. We have congestion charging. Of course, it's now an envy tax. It's now a case of anybody with a motor car that looks like a motor car, as opposed to a plastic bath, is going to be taxed. Now, I'm a Porsche driver, and Porsche are taking on Mayor Livingston. They've started a public campaign against the raising of the congestion charge to bring in a £25 charge for cars with large engines. The congestion charge is turning into a control of carbon emission, but not on any sliding scale of the size of the engine, simply in terms of cars that are liked, in other words, cars that are insignificant, ugly, and on the other hand, cars that have some prestige and some design quality. Now you may say it's very strange to hear a planner talking in this un-environmental way, but I drive less than 3,000 miles a year in my Porsche. My Porsche doesn't come out during the week when the congestion charge is in operation. I walk to work, and I live 10 minutes from my office. I use public transport. And what really annoys me is to see people in very small cars with very big smiles, as if they're doing the environment some good. Well, they're not, because they should be using the underground, they should be using the railways, they should be using the buses, not cars at all. Because all they're doing is getting in the way of people who are trying to get about a great city. So rather than thinking about large cars, cars that you can't afford versus cars you can afford and aren't worth having, rather than thinking in that sort of way, why don't we think about what carbon footprint of us personally is bringing to bear on the cities in which we live? And looking at the way our cities are planned to make it less necessary for people to expend carbon. There are some cities which are sustainable by virtue of having been around for a very long time. The City of London has been a community for over 2,000 years. And during that time it has made mistakes, of course, but it must have done something right to still be a city, and not just a city, but the world's leading financial centre. It has an inbuilt sustainability. And that's not simply an environmental sustainability because it's been sited at a convenient point on the planet. One where there's a temperate climate, where you don't need very much heating or very much cooling. You do need an umbrella, but it is a very mild climate. It's also very well served by public transport. 90% of all of the 90% of all the 330,000 people who work in our 1 square mile business district come to work by public transport. Another 5% walk or come by bike. So that leaves just 5% of the workers coming by car. Now, just think those figures through in relation to your own city and ask yourself, what is your figure for commuting to work by car? Because immediately that gives you an idea of the natural sustainability of your city, your development location. The other main aspect of sustainability, of course, is the cultural sustainability of a city, and I believe that to be the most important of all. London is polycultural. My authority carried out some research within the last 5 years to discover how polycultural London is. And we discovered that there are over 300 languages being spoken by school children in London every day. 300. It is a melting pot of cultures. And that's easy for London because, of course, London has always been that. London has no indigenous population. The English are immigrants. Now, I speak as a Celt, which is the equivalent of a North American native Indian. I'm one of the very few indigenous people left in the country. They were pushed to the west in Wales, and some into the Scotland in the north and across to Ireland. But the English came from Germany and from France and from many other countries, and from the outset, therefore, England was a country of immigrants, and there have been many, many, many waves of immigrants over the hundreds of years since that change. It's also been a great centre of tourism. Ever since the Romans came to England and left behind some very good Italian restaurants, London has been a centre for visitors. After that, of course, we had the Germans, the Saxons came, and then we had the Vikings. The Scandinavian tourists were not very well behaved, I'm afraid, but we had Vikings coming into the country, and then, of course, the Norman French came in and brought their French cuisine with them. And we've benefited from all of those waves of tourism and from all of those waves of people who've come to settle in London, to work and to live, and to become Londoners. London is one of those very few cities where any of you can be a Londoner. If you move to Paris, you can live in Paris, you'll be welcome in Paris, but you can never be a Parisian, even if you simply come from another French city. You have to be not only born in Paris, but your grandparents must have been born in Paris before you can even begin to think that you should call yourself a Parisian. But in London, if you come to visit, after 2 weeks, if you want to be, you are a Londoner. Because London is full of people just like you, it's full of foreigners. The English, of course, would say that I, as a Welshman, am a foreigner, but of course I would say that it was the other way round. But that basis of social melting together, the bringing together of all those cultures, is extremely powerful in terms of the sustainability and long-living nature of a city like London. The Ford Motor Company has its world design headquarters in the middle of Soho in London. Now, they don't advertise that fact, because of course their designs are top secret, and they don't want people to know where they are. You might imagine it is in some big American city, not at all. It's in the centre of Soho, and why? Because it's one of the most cultural places on the planet, one of the most inventive places on the planet. So many different ideas from so many different backgrounds rubbing together and creating new ideas, and that's where you get the greatest creativity. You'll notice that I haven't spoken about architecture. I haven't even spoken about buildings. And although it might be perhaps a little unpopular to say so at a conference like this, I don't believe that buildings are very important to the success of a city. Of course, if you're trying to create an image in an area that doesn't have one, in an international sense, you might choose architecture as a means to do that. Chicago, for instance, was very ordinary town by the side of a very big lake on the edge of a very big prairie on the way to the Wild West for many years. And then luckily it burnt down, and they were able to rebuild it at just the time that a certain gentleman invented the elevator. And so they built high-rise. And why did they build high-rise? Well, they built high-rise because nobody knew where they were. And they were saying, you guys, we're over here, just to mark themselves in that very flat landscape. Equally, we notice as we alight from the aircraft in Dubai that you are making 1 or 2 gesture buildings along your horizon. And again, we see a large area of water, although the area of water, as I see it, is getting smaller by the day as you build islands. And we see a large flat landscape. And of course, in those circumstances, building tall, building buildings, is one way to mark your presence, to mark your identity on that landscape and in the international psyche. And in doing so, of course, it's important that you make those buildings as sustainable as possible, to ensure that their energy use is as efficient as possible, to ensure that the buildings last as long as possible. And that is an interesting point, because I suppose in London we have 1 or 2 buildings, tall buildings, which in common day speak are old buildings now, because they were built in the 1960s or 70s. And what interests me is that it's those tall buildings that are the ones that have the longest life. They're the ones that get refurbished by having the outside skin removed and having the elevators replaced and the services replaced in the buildings. The structure carries on. The concrete columns, the concrete floors, they continue, and the building is completely refurbished. So when people say that tall buildings are of themselves unsustainable, I don't think that's necessarily true. The lower-rise buildings are the ones that get demolished right down back into the ground and then rebuilt again. That's where you have most of your embedded energy thrown away and the whole thing having to be recycled. As with the taller buildings, because of the investment in the structure, because of their presence, they often tend to be kept. And another reason, of course, is it's quite tough to get planning permission or development consent for a tall building. So if you've already got one, you don't want to lose your permission by knocking it down. So planning can sometimes be helpful in encouraging sustainability in a roundabout way. But if you are going to go for signature buildings, for iconic buildings, and again, that's an interesting one, isn't it? People say to me, since we built the Gherkin in the City of London, how do you build, or how do you plan for an iconic building? And I said, well, you can't. When the Gherkin design began, we hadn't asked for an icon. London's full of icons already. It has Tower Bridge and St Paul's Cathedral, Palace of Westminster. All of these buildings are famous throughout the world, so London didn't need an icon. The Gherkin was a response to the planning criteria, to the environmental constraints, and to the needs of the occupant of the building. And it happened to come out as a shape which the public adopted as an icon. It isn't architects that create icons, it's the public who adopt them. And so an awful lot of work in design studios around the world that goes into designing buildings to be icons is almost doomed to failure. And I think we are finding an awful lot of unusual shaped buildings. In fact, the last Ctbuh conference in Chicago was entirely themed around the idea of tilted, twisted, wacky shaped buildings, because an awful lot of people are putting a lot of effort into designing them in that way. Perhaps if we step back into looking at the brief and looking into the need for environmental sustainability, the need for meeting the brief and producing a building of longevity, then designs of themselves will come out as being iconic through their quality. But don't pursue icons, let icons pursue you. This aim then of making places sustainable through transport, through social inclusivity, this melting pot, and at the same time adding new buildings to your cities to enhance them, because the last thing we wish to do with our buildings is to reduce the quality of the areas in which they sit. These are the things that need to be brought together to make better places. And at the end of the day, that should be what we're all about, making places. Any fool can design a building. Any fool can design a square or an open space. But to make something which the public will inhabit and adopt and take as their own and make into a place, that is what takes skill. And you cannot make a place without involving not only the architect and the professionals and the client, but also involving the public, the people who live and work there. And it is that placemaking which is the skill. Any area which becomes a place is automatically sustainable. The people that live there will make it sustainable because they want to be there. It doesn't matter how good your building, if you build it in a suburban location, and let's face it, suburbia is the worst force at work on this planet. Suburbia is the virus that would destroy the earth if it can. Cities are about downtown, cities are about places, cities are about people coming together, not just living in houses in remote locations. Suburbs are not very sustainable. Interestingly, the countryside isn't at all sustainable. Cities are the most sustainable form of human life. In the countryside, for instance, people now live in the countryside using SUVs to drive to and from their homes, and in fact to drive to and from everything, because everything is so far apart. They expect to have internet connections, they expect to have good roads, and 2 minutes to go. And they expect to have all of the facilities of an urban area. It is only sustainable to live in the country if you're making food to feed people or looking after the land. Otherwise, you need to be living in cities close together, making those sustainable places where ideas come together, cultures come together, and we make the future. Thank you.